Dr. Shatner is an award-winning scientist, educator, and writer with over 30 years of research experience in molecular biology, genetics, medical instrumentation, and physics. He received his PhD from MIT under Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg, and has held research and teaching positions. I've lost my mouse, so I can't go any further. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Shatner.
Not quite. You're good. Indeed. Well, thank you, Brian. So, thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's a great pleasure. And thank all of you for the patience of sticking around. It was a surprise for me as well when I found out. So, let's get started. Okay, so let me give you a little overview of what I'll be talking about over the next hour, and I'm hoping this is going to be sort of informal, and so if there are questions or comments, I will interrupt from time to time and invite them, and of course at the end there'll be time for that as well. But since it's not that big a group, if something comes up and it's really on your mind, raise your hand and we should be able to deal with it. So in a nutshell, what I want to do in the next hour is tell you a little bit of an introduction about how I see biology and how it affects who we are in an everyday way, and I'll be using a few examples that are these are from my book. One has to do with what makes some people very strong. The other has to do with DNA and history, and the third has to do with sex, and finally science and ethics. But before we get started, I want to answer two quick questions. First of all, why am I giving this talk? And secondly, what do I expect you, in terms of background, to bring to this talk? So I've had two motivations for writing my book and for giving these talks. First of all, I want to convince you that anyone who's had a high school education and certainly even a little bit of college is capable of understanding the concepts of modern biology and is capable of understanding how they're really shaping the fundamentals of how we understand who we are as human beings, and that it's really interesting and it can be great fun to learn it. And my second reason is that not only do I think this material is fun and exciting and interesting, but I believe that we as humanity and as people are facing all kinds of questions, moral and ethical and non-scientific questions as we go into as we are in the 21st century, and having an understanding of how we are, how we behave as human beings, and how we fit into the rest of nature is critical information for us to act as citizens and knowledgeable citizens and human beings. So the other question I want to get out of the way real quickly is, what kind of background do you need for this talk and also for my book? And the answer is very simple. Zero, nada, zilch, except perhaps a sense of curiosity and wonderment about life. Like I say, I started out in physics and frankly trying to explain the concepts of physics and what I was working on there to the lay public was extremely difficult. And I never got real good at it. But molecular biology is not the same. If it's explained in clear terms and with fun examples, I will promise you will understand everything that's going on. My best proofreaders of my book were people who had zero science background whatsoever. So, in the interest of making this accessible to everybody who doesn't have much of a biology background, in order for us to be communicating quickly, 4 definitions. Proteins. We're going to need to talk about proteins. They're a class of biomolecules that make up the structures of most living organisms, whether it's muscle or other tissues or messengers, cytokines and hormones. They're nearly all the proteins. And proteins are strings. They're made up of strings of simpler building blocks, which are called amino acids. Number 2, DNA. DNA is a very long molecule It's made up of a different kind of simple building block called a nucleic acid, or actually 4 different nucleic acids. And they store the genetic blueprints for making proteins. That's all DNA, well, that's the main thing that DNA does. Third is a chromosome. And these are all words you've probably heard many times, but it's important that we all get on the same page as to what they are. A chromosome is simply a DNA molecule, which is plus the protective proteins that surround it and that are bound to it. Each of our cells has 46 chromosomes in it, and except for people who have very unusual genetic conditions, but for most of us. And last but not least, a gene. We all talk about genes. A gene is simply a region of DNA in that blueprint, that genetic blueprint, that specifies a single protein. A gene is not something that says, you know, you're going to be a scientist or a philosopher. It's not something that by itself says that you're going to have blue eyes or green eyes. It is something that specifies what protein, what is the form of each protein, of one protein. And it's the collection of all those proteins that make us the people we are. But that's all a gene is. Okay, got that out of the way pretty quickly. So let's get started. So this is the question that my book is about, this talk is about. Can 21st century biology answer age-old questions about the human experience? Can proteins and DNA help us understand how we make our choices in sex and love, how we communicate, where our emotions come from, or why we age and die? And of course my thesis here, and it's definitely known to be true, the answers to these questions is yes. They don't determine things, but they certainly shed light, and they certainly can help us understand how these things work. In the past, such questions have been reserved for philosophers and psychologists, and some will argue that this is as it should be, but I will argue that it's not the case. For we are biological animals, and by studying the biology of cells and proteins and DNA, we can learn a lot about what it means to be human. And in this audience, this may not be such a surprising notion that by looking at cells within within the brain, the body, we can learn about who we are as human beings. But for some people, it is a strange notion. And consider a couple of examples, and these are just 2 little introductory examples, one from the world of love and one from the world of language, to get our feet wet. First example is from the world of emotions and love. And as is often the case, it's easier to look at things in animals than in people, because animals are simpler to understand. And the specific animals we want to look at are called voles. Voles are sometimes known as field mice. They look a lot like mice. And there are many, many species of voles. 2 of them are prairie voles and meadow voles, and they're closely related. But there's one big difference, and their DNA is also, their DNA, the sequence of their blueprints are also quite closely related. However, there's at least one big difference between prairie voles and meadow voles. Prairie voles, well, let me turn it around. Meadow voles are like most animals in the animal kingdom, meaning to say that the males are promiscuous. They tend to have one-night stands with the ladies and then move on to the next conquest. They don't do much in terms of rearing the kids, and they're kind of like Romeos. Prairie voles, on the other hand, are devoted monogamous mates. They generally mate for life, and they're very active in child rearing and infant rearing. This will give you a little bit of a picture. These guys are prairie voles, and you can see, I don't even know which one is the male and which one is the female, but they're both taking care of the babies. This, on the other hand, is the loner, is a meadow vole. They're also loners, even amongst the males, they're loners. So they're very similar in appearance, but yet they have this one form of behavior that's very different. Now, because these are animals and not people, it's been possible to study them in a much more controlled manner than it's possible to study people. And in particular, by studying these voles, a single gene was discovered, coding for a single protein, And that both the gene and the protein have the name AVPR1A, and they're receptor proteins, meaning to say they exist, they're located in the membranes of cells where they detect something else, and particularly they detect the hormone called oxytocin. Now both prairie voles and both prairie voles and meadow voles have this, have receptors for oxytocin, but they're slightly different in form. And in fact, if you take prairie vole AVPR1A DNA and inject it into the brains of male meadow voles, and this is an experiment which has been done many times at this point, these otherwise or normally promiscuous animals turn into mates that are as faithful as prairie voles. So I should say that this is an unusual, that many of the examples I'll be giving, and this are extreme examples. It's kind of unusual in the world of biology and genetics that one gene, when one variant can be found that has such a dramatic effect. Usually that's many genes, but I like these. I will be giving you a couple of these they're not simplified, they're real examples, but they're unusual examples just to illustrate a point and to make it clear what I'm talking about. So in this one case, changing this one genetic variant changes the behavior of a promiscuous male into that of a dedicated mate. Let me give you another example. This is from what I'm calling the world of language, or the world of communication. And this has to do with zebra finches. Zebra finches are birds, and they're among the many large class of birds where the male attracts the female in part by singing. And in fact, young males learn to sing from their fathers, and nearly all zebra finches, when their songs are studied, and these songs are studied both simply by listening, but also through acoustic measurements. Essentially, every young male zebra finch learns to sing the same song. And just for example, these are zebra finches. This is the male, has an orange patch, and the female without the orange patch, and they're not singing at the moment. These are obviously birds that were from captivity, the band here, but that's what zebra finches look like. But the interesting part for our story here is that there's a single protein called FOXP2, and if one disables, if a zebra finch either naturally or through biological experimentation has this one protein disabled, and it's a male zebra finch, the male zebra finch is unable to learn how to sing the zebra finch song, even though everything else is fine. So this is another case where it doesn't mean, I should say this doesn't mean that FOXP2 is the way the bird sings, because as we know, for instance, from cars, if you have brakes in a car, which involves many different pieces, all you have to do is break one of those pieces, and that function of the car will not work. So similarly, the function in a bird of learning how to sing or call involves an interaction of many different proteins. But what has been learned is that if this particular one is broken, the bird cannot sing. Now, it may be tempting to discount such animal experiments as merely confirming that humans are very different from animals. Yet consider these recent discoveries. Autism is characterized by difficulties in expressing love and affection. Now, autism is a very complicated disease, and it's only... Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, just pull the microphone away from your face a little bit so it doesn't pop. Take it.
Yeah. So autism is a very complex disease, and the roots and causes of autism are only very, very slowly being understood. However, and one thing that is being understood is that autism is actually many, many different diseases with similar symptoms, many, many causes. But in some cases, autism has been linked to impaired oxytocin signaling, the same brain pathway that affects pair bonding in voles. And in fact, a few physicians have been experimenting with trying to treat autistic children with oxytocin. Now, this is very, very preliminary stuff, but it just shows that what one learns from something like the vole may have applications and be not totally removed from what's happening with people. In fact, there are even a few autistic individuals have been found to have rare variants in the AVPR1A gene, the one that's involved in oxytocin signaling that distinguishes between prairie voles and meadow voles behavior. So I want to say this is all, the link to autism, there's something there, but it's much more tenuous what it is than what we know so far in animals. But there are folks who are exploring this, and these are just two examples of papers that have come out within the last few years in which autism is being studied by administering oxytocin in an attempt to have more loving feelings, in quotation marks, whatever that means, in autistic people in a way that's analogous to the way that oxytocin signaling has been observed in voles. Yeah.
Can you tell which autistic people will be affected by oxytocin and which won't?
Okay. So the question is, the question is, can one tell which autistic people will be affected by oxytocin and which won't? I believe the current state of the art is initially no. I think, to my best of my recollection, the way all the experiments have been done today is that they would take a large number of autistic people, and for example, look for variations in the AVPR1 gene or variations in oxytocin reception, and take a similar number of people who are not autistic and see which ones among, and see which ones among the group seem to be helped by the autism. Ultimately, one would expect, one would certainly be able to, certainly in voles again, one can look, there are certain, among the prairie voles, for example, there are variations in the AVPR1 gene among prairie voles. And the ones which have gene variants that look most similar to the ones that meadow voles have, indeed have been seen to have behavior that is most similar to the behavior. So in the world of animals, in the world of experimental animals, one is already able to do that to a pretty good degree. In the case of humans, it's still very, very tough. People are very complicated. That's going to be one of the recurring themes here, is that we study animals because it's easier to get a controlled experiment. It's easier to get rid of extraneous factors that you don't know how to deal with and handle properly otherwise. Now, just for a moment, let's go and talk for just a moment about FOXP2 in people, and then I'll take a little time for a few questions. But in the 1990s, British researchers discovered a family that had severe language difficulties. And there were like a dozen members of this family who had more or less normal intelligence, more or less normal hearing and normal vocal cords, yet they essentially couldn't speak, or they spoke in very garbled ways, they had trouble understanding language, but like I say, otherwise they were more or less normal intelligence. And genetic analysis revealed that the afflicted family members, and only those family members, shared a single defective variant in the FOXP2 gene, as a result of which they had defective FOXP2 protein, which was the same protein that is necessary for zebra finches to sing properly. In fact, the history of the science was that this family was discovered first, and it was noticed, there are tens of thousands of genes and millions of genetic variants, so even though you find a family which has a problem, figuring out what is the genetic cause, assuming there even is a genetic cause, is very, very difficult. But it was found that there was this one gene, FOXP2, that had a variant that was different in all the affected family members, and that was the motivation for doing the experiment in the zebra finches, which then convincingly showed that there was a link there. And indeed, this is just the paper where this family was initially found, and the way we're going to see a few of these kind of graphs, and the way these graphs work, the squares are males, the circles are females, and the ones that have that are shaded in have the genetic defect. And you can see about half of these family members all had a language problem, and indeed they were the ones who had this this genetic variant. Now again, most people who have language disabilities, there are all kinds of reasons why that could come from. Many of them genetic, some of them not. This particular one, the FOXP2, is actually quite rare. It has been found in a few other families, but it's nice because it's one defect caused one problem, so it's been very clear. Okay, so I kind of whizzed through a couple of introductory examples here. Do we have any question at this point? Yeah.
Yeah, you said that the DNA was injected into the brains of the voles. I wasn't aware that you could inject DNA into an animal and have it have any effect on protein production and things like that.
Well, okay. Exactly how there are different ways these things are done. And I'm not remembering quite exactly how this particular experiment was done. The way it is often done is that embryonic cells are taken from taken into a test tube, and then in the test tube, the DNA is injected into the cells, and it's reimplanted, and you get a whole strain of animals. Sometimes it's done that the DNA that's injected is put in a way so that the gene is only expressed, meaning that the gene is only converted into protein in certain cells, such as in the brain. My memory is that in this particular experiment, it actually was an injection into the brain. And how the mechanics of it, I don't know, I don't remember. But there are different ways. There are different ways of doing it. Yep.
Hello? Okay. So you talked about different varieties of genes, which I believe are called alleles. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do all genes have roughly the same number of alleles, or are there like some genes that have many alleles and some have very few?
Okay.
Alleles?
So let's go back a step, and I talk about genetic variants, by which I mean to say that the DNA is a sequence of these nucleic acids, and they are generally, there are 4 of them, and they're often described just by their initial letters, A, C, G, and T. And it's the different ordering of those 4 letters that determine the structure of the different proteins, and when and whether they're expressed in the brain or in the elbow or under what circumstances. Now, if there's a slight difference, then you will have what I call a genetic variant. It's a place where the DNA varies from one person to another. So the first thing to respond to is if you start reading certainly the scientific literature and unfortunately also the popular literature, you will find many other words that mean the exact same thing as a genetic variant. One of them is allele, another one is polymorphism, and then there's another one which is slightly different, which is a mutation. And a mutation is just a genetic variant, but it's one that happens later. Meaning to say, if you have 2 genetic variants, you don't know which one was the first one in general, and which one came because of something happening and it changed and happened later. If you happen to know this one came first and the other one came second, then you call the second one a mutation. So that's just language, but I'll be using the term genetic variant. So now I'll rephrase your question, which is, do all genes have the same number of genetic variants? Does all DNA have the same amount of genetic variants or the same number of alleles? And the answer is a very emphatic no. And there's a lot that can be said about that, but just to give you one or two little tidbits, for example, there's certain proteins that are extremely important. And they're important that they're built in exactly the right way and in only one way. And those proteins, if you look at the DNA letters that code for them, in almost every person, you will find exactly the same number of letters and exactly the same sequence of letters. Because if one of those changed, chances are the embryo would not have, and the fetus would not have made it into being conceived as a person. So that's one extreme. In fact, in some cases when a protein is incredibly important, you will discover that the human variant and the mouse variant and the monkey variant all look almost exactly the same. On the other hand, if it's something like a protein that affects hair color or a protein that affects eye color, you'll find all kinds of variants, and some will do just as well as others. And usually, in most places in the genome meaning the collection of all of of any one person, there will be lots of variants. Even within one person, there will be often two variants. One variant you got from mom, the other variant you got from dad. But it depends. Okay, so let's go to the next little story here. And this story is what makes a super athlete. And in particular, we're going to talk about what makes folks strong. And again, I'm going to take a very extreme example, and from a very extreme real example, but from this extreme real example, we can learn something about more normal or typical people. So the extreme example is an infant we'll call Heinrich. He's a real boy. His name was withheld usually in scientific and medical articles. They don't publish people's names, so his name is not given in the article. But it is known that he was born in a Berlin hospital in 1999. And when he was just 6 days old, ultrasound examinations showed that he was far more muscular than other babies. In fact, even as soon as he was born, the doctors knew that he was a very unusual kid. By the time he was 4 years old, he was lifting 3-kilogram dumbbells. This is from the original paper describing him, and you can see that this little boy is pretty muscular even as a newborn. Now, the fact that this is an extreme example where someone genetically has become super strong, but even in much more common cases, we know that athletic excellence often runs in families. And we even know that although that by itself does not prove that athletic excellence is genetic. I mean, after all, if someone is a super trainer or coach and he or she has 2 children, they may teach them both how to become good athletes. So that simply the fact that athletic excellence often runs in families does not by itself mean that it's genetic. However, by comparing identical and non-identical twins, who would in both cases share the same parents, but in one case share much more genetics than the other, it is known there is a lot of genetic component to athletic ability and in particular to strength. In fact, in some cases, the genetic differences in muscle strengths are painfully obvious. For example, if something is broken, and one example is there's a certain genetic variants that cause defective proteins which lead to muscular dystrophy and very weak. But that's a case where a broken protein leads to a disease. But there are also cases where an enhanced protein might lead to very strong athletic ability. Actually, for most of us, the muscular development system works just fine. We have proteins to regulate how much muscle we make, and we don't make too little muscle, and we don't make too much muscle. Most of us who don't have muscular dystrophy do just fine. But it does beg the question, how much muscle is just right? Maybe if we each made a little bit more muscle, we'd be just a bit stronger. If we had the genetic predilection to make more muscle, we'd be a little bit stronger, and maybe there wouldn't be anything wrong with that. So to explore that possibility, actually, they were trying to find treatments for muscular dystrophy, but it works to the same thing. In 1997, a group of scientists at Johns Hopkins were searching for mouse genes involved in muscle growth. So again, the mouse genes, they just code for proteins, but they were looking for proteins that seemed to be involved in muscle growth for various reasons. They might be similar to genes that have been found defective in humans with muscular dystrophy for whatever reason. And they found one gene, which they called myostatin, and which coded for a protein, which is also called myostatin. And they created a knockout mouse. Now, I go into more detail in the book describing, but what a knockout mouse is basically, it's an animal that has been genetically manipulated, and I describe how that works in the book, so that the mouse has one gene disabled. That the scientists are able to disable a single gene so that they have a controlled experiment and can see, well, what happens to mice if this one gene is broken and all their other genes are exactly, all their other proteins are coded for in exactly the same way. And so that's what they did. They created, well, they actually created many strains of mice with a single gene knocked out. One of those strains was a strain of mice which had the gene for myostatin knocked out. And surprisingly, they found that the gene with non-functional myostatin had muscles that were twice the size of other mice. Now, at first, this sounds kind of crazy. This is a mouse with a, quote, broken protein, but it's twice as muscular. And just here, this is a photograph from the mice from that lab. The mouse on the left is your basic lab mouse, and the mouse on the right is not only a basic lab mouse, but it's from the same genetic strain. Meaning to say it has essentially the exact same set of genetic variants as the mouse on the left, with one exception, which it has a broken protein. It has a genetic variant for myostatin leading to a broken protein for myostatin. And what was discovered was that myostatin essentially acts like a brake, like the brakes in your car. It is a protein that is there to, quote, make sure that you don't make too much protein, don't make too much muscle. And by breaking that brake, you're able to create a mouse that's supramuscular. And I should say that these mice seem pretty healthy. And they've been studied somewhat, and there's nothing obviously wrong with them. They're just real muscle bound. Let me finish the little story, and we'll get to that shortly. But I want to continue this just a little bit and say that mice are actually not the only animals that have taught people something about myostatin and the importance of myostatin. We've also learned about myostatin from dogs. Some of you may be familiar with a breed of dog called the Whippet. It's like a little greyhound. It's a sleek dog that's bred for running. And occasionally, and like just about essentially every other mammal, it has myostatin. It produces myostatin. But occasionally a Whippet will inherit a non-functional myostatin, a gene for non-functional myostatin protein, to be precise, from either one of its parents or both of its parents. Now, if a Whippet inherits a broken myostatin gene from both parents, then it has a very muscular and looks like a rather different kind of a dog. So this is an otherwise normal Whippet with two non-functional myostatin proteins. I'm sorry? Let me go through a couple more slides and then we'll have time for a couple of questions. I should say that if Whippets have also been found that have inherited one non-functional myostatin gene and one functional one. I'm being a little sloppy, and sometimes I'll say a non-functional myostatin gene. That's shorthand for a genetic variant leading to a non-functional myostatin protein. And those Whippets look completely normal, but they tend to be very fast runners. I should say that the ones with, these guys, the muscle-bound ones, as far as anyone, sadly, because of the way humans are at times, these muscle-bound Whippets are often euthanized. But if they're not euthanized, because they seem to be quite healthy, and nothing seems to be particularly wrong with them. Now, I just want to give one more little example here about myostatin, and this time comes from the world of cows. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, I'm going to finish my story here on myostatin, and then we're going to open up for a few questions. There are many breeds of cattle, and one of which are called Belgian Blues. And they're a breed of cattle prized for their lean musculature. And not long after the discovery of myostatin, scientists tested the DNA of Belgian Blue cows, these very muscular cows, and discovered that they too carried non-functional variants of the myostatin gene. And so this is a case, the opposite of the case with the whippets, where people, this is what I like, either the whippets and the cows are both of what I call examples of unnatural selection. It's not nature doing the selection, it's human beings. But in the case of whippets, people don't like to have the super muscular animals. In the case of cattle, people do like to have very muscular animals because we don't generally look at the animals, we just look at the beef that comes from them. So far that's from the world of animals. But before the birth of this boy Heinrich, who I'm calling Heinrich, it wasn't known whether disabling myostatin genes existed in people as well. But because of Heinrich's unusual physical abilities, his DNA was tested for unusual genetic variants, and because these mice were already known, his DNA was tested in particular for myostatin. The DNA sequence of his myostatin gene was also tested. And the test revealed that both copies of Heinrich's myostatin gene produced non-functional myostatin protein. And it turned out as it turns out, both the mice, the dogs, the cows, and Heinrich all have different genetic variants for myostatin. But what they have in common is that they all break the protein. Since both copies of Heinrich's myostatin gene are non-functional, most likely his mother and his father each had at least one non-functional copy of the myostatin gene. And indeed, Heinrich's mother was an Olympic sprint swimmer. And although no information has ever been given on Heinrich's father, several of Heinrich's other relatives were described as being, quote, unusually strong. And this is from one of the original articles. This is the maternal family tree of Heinrich. How are we doing here? Do we have a light?
Yeah.
There it is. So this is Heinrich. This is Heinrich's mother, Heinrich's uncle, Heinrich's grandfather, Heinrich's great-grandfather, and I guess second cousin or something like that. And not all of these people have been able to have their DNA tested. So it isn't known, but one can guess that the individuals here who were known from family history to have been extremely strong most likely all had that genetic variant that Heinrich had. It's most likely this genetic variant is extremely rare, but before Heinrich, nobody had actually looked for it, and so just how rare it is isn't known. I'm not aware. I'm aware of other people who have been identified who are quite strong with genetic variants in proteins that are related to myostatin, but not myostatin itself. So I'll make a request to turn off cell phones, and if there are any questions, a couple questions at this point. Yep. Yep. Okay.
I was wondering, you said.
Please pick up. Oh.
Okay, these muscular Heinrich and Mighty Mouse and the rest of them.
Yeah.
Don't they require more food than the average?
I don't actually remember, to tell you the truth. Whether it's not. Oh, great, thank you. I actually don't know, but you know what has been tested. What has definitely been tested is that they seem to be healthy. I mean, it is known with the long. I mean, Heinrich is all of about, I think, 14. Well, he was 1999, so he's 16 now. In the last paper that I'm aware of him, he was 12, and at the time he was 12, he was quite a muscular boy, but seemed to be healthy. But what whether he'll have heart disease when he's 40, is currently known. So, I mean, health consequences have been looked at, and so far nothing terrible seems to be there. Quite frankly, if I knew that I was young and knew that I could be an Olympic athlete, and the only price I was paying was that I had to eat a little bit more, I wouldn't necessarily consider that too high a price to pay. One more question, yeah.
So are the double myostatin gene deficient dogs the ones that are really muscular? Are they now slower than the ones with just one bad gene? Or because they're stronger, are they then faster?
I don't know. I'm guessing. Now we're getting to the world of humans. I don't know how fast they are. The short answer to your question is I don't know. My guess is that in the world of whippet racing, they may not permit dogs that look like that to race. What I do know, which is an interesting, which is something I go into much more detail in the book, is that there is a trade-off in terms of animals, such as including both dogs and people, who are good sprinters and good marathon runners, for example, this particular variant that exists in whippets does not exist in greyhounds, which tend to be in longer races. And so it's quite possible that even if there were such a genetic variant in greyhounds, it would not have been bred, because it wouldn't be much of an advantage for a greyhound. Greyhounds in the greyhound races. So there are trade-offs there. Why don't I do another little story here, and then we'll actually, how much more time do we have here? I might want to skip this one and go.
About 15 minutes.
Yeah, why don't I skip this story? It's a nice story. This is a story you'll be able to, you can read about in the book if you want to, or if we have more time, we'll come back to it. But basically, just the headline of this story is simply that it's about one of the early DNA tests of ancestry, of genetic ancestry, and it's one that it was a test that showed, among other things, that if you're not very careful, you can be very misled. Because this particular genetic test, if given to African Americans, for 30% of them, it tells them that their ancestry is from Europe and not from Africa. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the DNA, there's nothing wrong with the genetics, but it's a matter of, the lesson here is how you interpret what the science is telling you. And like I say, if we have time, we'll come back to it, but I think we'll, in the interest, we'll skip this one. And we'll talk about sex. So what determines sex? And I'm going to talk about the man with no Y chromosome, or a man with no Y chromosome. And I'll talk about what a Y chromosome is. I'm assuming most of you probably know, but if not, I will talk about that in a moment, so just hold that in abeyance. But we're going to start. This is a story about a man, a real man, an Italian man, and he was in his mid-40s, who came to a clinic in Italy, and he appeared at first glance to be completely normal. He had normal male sex drive and appeared to be happily married, but he was childless, and he and his wife really wanted to have children, and they had been he'd been attempting to father a child throughout his 10-year marriage. And a standard medical examination revealed that his testosterone levels were low and that his testes were abnormally small. And then laboratory testing showed that his sperm count was 0. So the fact that he couldn't father a child was not surprising. You need a sperm to have a child. But his DNA test, when they tested his DNA, did reveal a surprise. He had 2 X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. And I'll talk in a moment about what the significance of that is. Many of you probably know. But the short answer here is, according to traditional genetics, he was a woman. Now, the X and the Y chromosome, I mentioned that each of us and each of our cells, except for, again, very rare exceptions, we all have 46 chromosomes. They come in pairs of 22, and then there are the 2 so-called sex chromosomes. About half the people in the world, and perhaps somewhat more than half the people in this room, have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome, and nearly all of those people are men. And about half the people in the world, a little less than half the people in this room, have no Y chromosome and 2 X chromosomes, and those people are nearly all women. But it doesn't always work that way. Women generally have 2 X's, men generally have 1 X and 1 Y. Yet some people have chromosomes that appear to be incompatible with their physical appearance, showing us that the relationship between chromosomes and our sex is not so simple. As the gentleman I introduced with, who I call Mario in the book, is one such example. He's rare, but he's definitely not unique. In fact, our sex is determined less by our chromosomes than by individual genes and the genetic variants that are on those chromosomes, and as a result, the proteins that they encode. So, for example, on the Y chromosome, in the huge majority of men, is a gene which has been given the name SRY, standing for sex-related Y chromosome gene. And that is the protein that's created by that gene, that's specified, is the one that triggers the biochemical chain of events that lead a fetus to become a boy. And in general, women who do not have a Y chromosome, therefore do not have an SRY gene and do not have an SRY protein, will be triggered to go down a different developmental path. But if there's certain kinds of genetic variants along the way, things can go in strange directions. So, for example, healthy, albeit infertile men may not have a Y chromosome, while normal females may have a Y chromosome. And in fact, such people may go through their entire lives and not know that they don't have, quote, the correct chromosome. And usually they only find out if they go to the doctor for genetic analysis for some reason, either because they want to have a child and they can't, or sometimes these conditions are discovered because the doctor is testing for certain kinds of cancer. And to do that, you have to look at all the chromosomes, and they discover, boy, this has the wrong kind of, the wrong number for what you would think. It's also possible, and actually somewhat more common, to inherit a set of genetic variants that lead to partly male and partly female sexual characteristics. This is sometimes called partial sex reversal or intersex. In fact, according to one article, in approximately 1 out of every 2,000 births, even the doctor performing the delivery is unsure of the sex of the newborn. And so these kids can be these kids who then grow up to be adults. They may have both a penis and a clitoris. They may have both ovaries and testes. They may have ovaries and testes that are sort of halfway in between. These are all things that can happen as part of the normal development, or not normal in quotation marks, is part of the spectrum of development that can happen to a human being. Now, in non-human animals, sexual ambiguity can be even stranger. And you can even have animals that are really half male and half female. Now, you may remember that we talked earlier about zebra finches. This is a real zebra finch. Half of it is male and half of it is female. You may remember that the male zebra finch has the orange cheek and the female has the non-orange cheek. And actually, with this bird, if and this is something, this is very rare, but it was there were 2 eggs that developed at the same time inside, with different sperms, but this sort of thing can happen. I'm not aware that this has ever happened in a human, but it can happen in animals. But there are even stranger things that happen, again, not in humans, but in animals. Because in people and other mammals, genes do determine who is male, and genetic variants, who will be male and who will be female. Even in the case of Mario, even who didn't have a Y chromosome, it was genetic variants that determined that he came out looking like a man. Yet in some animal species, males and females are identical genetically. Instead, it's the environment that determines an animal's sex. For example, in marine turtles, whether a turtle egg will become male or female depends on the temperature at which the egg is incubated. If the temperature is below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 100% of the hatchlings become females. Above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, they all become males. So needless to say, as a little aside here, you can understand that global warming is a real issue for animals of this particular type. And they're not unique. They're unusual, but they're not by any means unique. But frankly, if you think environmental sex determination is strange, there's also environmental sex reversal, which I find even stranger. These are animals, again, we're talking about primarily reptiles, birds, fish, that are born either male or female, but these animals can spontaneously change their sex after birth in response to their environment. Often it's in response to temperature or acidity in the water. But my favorite example is from a type of fish, which is called the cleaner wrasse. The cleaner wrasse is a fish species that's found in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And they're all born as females. All of them are born as females with ovaries, though they also have very small undeveloped testes. Oh, by the way, they're called cleaner fish because they actually clean parasites off the scales of other fish. They live in social groups consisting of a single dominant aggressive male and a group of 3 to 6 females, called a harem for obvious reasons. They look pretty unremarkable. That's what they look like. Now, if a male dies, if you have a harem, which has one male and, say, a half dozen female, if the male in the harem dies or is removed, say, by an experimentalist, a neighboring male fish may come and abduct the harems and abduct the females into his harem. But if no other male is around, something much stranger happens. The biggest and most aggressive, and dare I say the nastiest, of the females spontaneously changes sex and becomes a male who then takes over the harem. And the testes of this newly male fish are soon spawning fish sperm, whereas just a few weeks earlier, its ovaries had been spawning eggs. So, I guess what I want to say with some of these stories, in particular the stories about the men who discover they have 2 X chromosomes, and as you may know or you can read about in the book, there are men and women who have, some of whom have 2 X and a Y chromosome, or 1 X and no Y chromosome. There's a huge range of variety, and we're all people, and there is a tendency to say that we all have to be a certain way, but the truth of science is that we come in many different flavors, and in many cases there are no particular health disadvantages, except perhaps not being able to have children, and but yet the kind of discrimination such people face can be quite remarkable. In other chapters of the book, I talk more about things like sexual orientation and gender identity and things like that, which again are within the diversity of the human rainbow, and for which we are beginning to start to see the biological underpinnings. A question or two? Yeah.
I was going to ask about gender identity because you mentioned a man with 2 X chromosomes. Could this be the beginning of a transgendered person? Is there anything genetic in that?
Okay, so the short answer to your question is no. What I'm talking about is something quite different here, because in the case of Mario, he looks like a man and he feels like a man. He doesn't have any identity issues. And there are people like that. There are other people, it's just that his chromosomes seem to be telling another story. In the case of transgender, it's people whose bodies say one thing, and whose chromosomes may or may not say something, but whose brains say something different. And much, much less. There has been some efforts to try to understand the biological basis of things like gender identity. There's been much less progress. That's part of the reason why I chose the example I did, because I like to, start out with things that are kind of clear-cut and easy to understand. So there's much less that's understood in either the case of sexual orientation or gender identity. But from looking at There is evidence showing that there is something biological going on here, but just what it is at the molecular level is basically not yet understood. One more question?
Let me get you the mic.
I wanted to ask a question that's something in the news at this time is Bruce Jenner, who's sort of gone across the border from one side to another. And I used to wonder about him because I sort of knew him personally. I was a reporter, and I always suspected that he is won the Olympic gold medal.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
In the decathlon, no less.
but before they started testing for drugs, and I always wondered if all those drugs that those athletes, not just him, took during several generations. This goes all the way back to the Germans pumping their female ladies with swimmers with drugs. But I wondered if that had anything to do with anything of his biological factors.
I think the answer is I don't know, and no one knows. But Bruce Jenner is definitely an interesting example. Chaz Bono is another very interesting example.
Does this go the other way? Do
I'm sorry?
males often turn
I'm
into
sorry?
females? You were saying that females can turn into males. Can it go the other direction?
Oh,
males turn into females.
I'm not aware of that in the cleaner wrasse. I'm not aware of it in the cleaner wrasse. I think I would be if it happened there. Whether it's true in other animals, I don't know. I think, in the interest of time, I would like to talk for a few minutes about science and morality and ethics, and maybe 5 minutes, and then there'll be, if the folks might have questions and you want to come buy a book or talk to me individually, I'd love to talk to you. So I just want to say that the scientific method is great for answering scientific problems. However, there are some questions will never be answered by science. And these include important moral and ethical questions. However, even for these questions, knowing something about biology is useful and important. Because there are going to be questions that are coming up, and I'm just going to go through some of these very, very quickly. And at the moment, people are, can be found not guilty because of insanity, which has some biological basis. But there's now indications that other kinds of behavior, like violent behavior and other kinds of antisocial behavior, might have biological bases in some cases. When should we exonerate, forgive a crime for someone like that? I'm not going there. I'm just saying these are things the people that we as a society need to be thinking about. What types of genetic manipulations of animals and plants are morally acceptable? I know there was one person here in the group, who was quite concerned about that. Interesting question. We need to do these manipulations if we want to learn about treating disease and doing other things, but they are questions that go with it, and it's important that we understand what kind of manipulations can be done in order to be intelligent citizens about it. How should we balance the medical research potential of genetic information from our desire for privacy? In order for a lot of the genetic work in particular to be done, it's going to be necessary to combine medical records with DNA, with DNA knowledge. And once that is done, it's possible to work backwards and figure out who's who, and what insurance companies might find out about it. It's another question we're going to have to face. And then one question I want to look at a little bit more in just a tad more detail has to do with terminating pregnancies. When should society restrict prospective parents from terminating a pregnancy? For example, if it's known, and there are cases now where it's known, case of diseases like, you may have heard names like Tay-Sachs disease, Niemann-Pick disease, awful diseases. And if a child, and there's essentially no treatment for it, and it's now fairly well accepted that if parents find out that they have a kid that has these genetic variants, that child will have Tay-Sachs disease, and it's considered acceptable to have an abortion. But now it's getting to the point where it'll be rather possible and probably much more common that you'll be able to find in a genetic variant that'll say, well, this child, this so far unborn child, will have an 80% chance of having such a genetic disease. Is that a reason to abort the child? Or it'll have a 50% chance, or a 10% chance. Where do you draw the line? And should parents in the future, and again, this is in the future, it may well be possible, this is not yet known, but it may be possible to say, I want a child that's very strong. I only want a child that's got a myostatin variant. I'm going to abort the other ones. Or I want a child which has, greater intellectual ability, and that's starting to become possible. Or I want a child with certain sexual orientation. Now, those genetic variants are not yet known, but they may well be known, and we're going to have to decide how we're going to deal with that. And so I think I'll kind of leave it at that, and skip the last little example I had here, and just put up the take-home messages. So I hope I've begun to persuade you that our biology plays an important role in shaping who we are. That understanding those concepts of modern biology is a key part of being informed citizens. You don't need any special background to understand these concepts, and that it can be fun and fascinating. And so, if you want more information, I certainly encourage you to come buy my book. I'd be happy to sign copies for you. You can also get more information. You can find out you can buy it on Amazon, or you can check out my website. Encourage to tell your friends about it. If you know other venues that you think might enjoy a talk like that, please come and talk to me. In fact, that's why I'm here right now, is that I gave this talk about 4 or 5 months ago at the Sunnyvale Book Discussion Group, and one of your members responded to this and said you should talk to the AC Society of San Jose. So I said, sign me up. And that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the show.